Now, I'm not talking about the Zeus you might be picturing right now. And if you were to climb Mount Olympus, you probably wouldn't find him there either. In fact, I'm not really talking only about Zeus, but about all the gods from these ancient mythologies. The same thing applies to all of them. They could be real, or rather they could once have been real. That may sound a little far-fetched, but let me explain. Imagine you are a member of a hunter-gatherer tribe thousands of years ago. The chief of your group is genuinely extraordinary. He's incredibly strong and can effortlessly lift heavy stones. On top of that, you experience many adventures with him. Eventually, however, he grows old and dies. Later, you have children. And in the evenings, when everyone is sitting around the campfire, you tell them stories. And because you have so many memories of your old chief, you naturally tell them stories about him. Most of you can probably already see where this is going. In any case, your children eventually have children of their own, and they pass your stories about the chief on to them, though they change a detail here and there. Before long, the heavy stones he could lift become entire boulders. In their children's stories, those boulders become mountains. After several generations, this chief has become a kind of supernatural role model, no longer merely the subject of bedtime stories, but a hero for everyone. And because people believe that the dead continue to exist as spirits of some kind, it feels as though the chief is still around. At some point, the detail that he once died disappears altogether. As time passes and humanity develops further, with things like agriculture and metalworking emerging, the people who know the stories of this chief, or by now this actual god, become very influential. As a result, the myth surrounding him spreads. Of course, this theory is difficult to confirm because it concerns periods before writing existed, but it still seems highly plausible. And if it is true, then many gods of the past, from Zeus to Odin, would ultimately trace back to real people who once lived and acted in the world. Naturally, I'm not the first person to have this idea. One of the earliest people to write it down was the ancient Greek writer Euhemerus in the 4th century BC. He also believed that this approach could explain the gods who were omnipresent in his own time. It is worth noting that he was influenced by a phenomenon that appears to strongly support this theory: the deification of rulers, known as apotheosis. In many civilizations of the ancient world, such as ancient Egypt and centuries later Imperial Rome, it was common to regard rulers as godlike. And at first this sounds absurd to a modern audience, but it is actually much closer to reality than one might think. Today many people hear the word God and immediately think of the god of monotheistic religions such as Christianity or Islam, a being who truly stands above everything else, all-knowing and all-powerful. God with a capital G. But this description does not really fit gods such as Zeus or Odin, written with a lowercase g. They are certainly powerful, but not infinitely so, and often not even immortal. In that context, the entire idea of deification begins to make much more sense. Just think of the dictatorships of the 20th century, such as Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union under Stalin. In those systems, dictators were often elevated almost to the level of supernatural beings. What prevented actual deification was the deeply rooted belief in many societies that there is only one god, or even among atheists, the assumption that if a god exists, it would be an all-powerful one rather than many different gods. There was also, of course, the greater understanding of the world that people possessed by then. Apart from deliberate attempts to portray rulers as divine beings, there are also other, less sinister developments. For example, in Central European folklore, the Apostle Peter gradually came to be seen as a kind of weather god, if you will. This is because he is venerated as the keeper of the gates of heaven, and from there it is easy to assume that he might have something to do with the weather as well. This could also offer a possible explanation for the domains associated with different gods. A historical person who eventually became known as a war god, for instance, may originally have been associated with warfare because he was a particularly brave warrior or military leader. The same principle could apply to other divine domains as well, although the connections may sometimes be more difficult to identify. Euhemerism was especially popular during the Middle Ages and among early Christians because it seemed to confirm that pagan gods were inferior beings. Interestingly, many people in the Middle Ages did not regard Norse, Greek or similar deities as mere fictional characters. Rather, they believed that these beings really did exist or had existed in some form. Therefore, it made sense that scholars attempted to find understandable explanations for them. A very good example is the Icelander Snorri Sturluson, who wrote the Prose Edda around 1220, a collection of Norse myths and one of the most important sources we have today for Norse mythology. He claimed that the Norse gods also originated from historical kings and even speculated about their origins. He believed that Odin was based on a person who originally came from Anatolia and was related to a legendary Trojan king. Admittedly, it is rather unlikely that this explanation is exactly correct, but the general approach is plausible. Or is it? We have looked at several good examples, but how many gods can really be explained through euhemerism? And how relevant is it in the first place? Well, as so often, the answer probably lies somewhere in the middle. Some gods can probably be traced back to real historical individuals, others probably cannot. Even there, however, the boundary is likely blurred. Stories about a single deity were probably often inspired by multiple real people without being directly connected to any of them. And even if one person gradually becomes a god, that process probably already presupposes a belief in supernatural things such as spirits. In general, the origin story of a deity is probably far more complex than we might think. The question of how different gods acquired their specific domains is difficult enough on its own. In the case of a war god, as previously mentioned, the explanation seems obvious, but how does someone become, for example, a moon god? Ultimately, it is very likely that deification of the sort described by euhemerism occurred many times throughout history. How often and in relation to which gods is something we will probably never be able to determine. And that raises another question: how much would it really matter? For one thing, many people no longer believe in the deities that might be explained by euhemerism, or where such an explanation is even plausible. And secondly, an origin in the deification of a historical person would have very little to do with what the deity eventually became. Even if Zeus was ultimately based on a real human being, that person probably never lived on Mount Olympus or actively worked toward the founding of Rome. In much the same way, one could say that although all land-dwelling animals descend from creatures that once lived in the water, modern house cats do not have very much in common with fish anymore. Now, that's it for the video. Consider liking and subscribing, and see you in the next one.